Hmm. Hmm.
Hi, Professor.
Ah, hello.
Hi, I was wondering, for the reading response, I don't know if you said it already, but can it be double spaced or single space as long as it's under the character count?
Yes. I just saw that question actually. I prefer double spaced,
Okay,
but
good.
yeah, it's not a super big deal because everything is being graded electronically.
Right,
Um, and usually double spacing is like a concern if you're actually, grading something on paper with a pen or something, right? So,
right.
yeah. I don't care either way, but double spaced is, I guess, the preferred standard, right?
Okay, good, because I like that better
Okay,
for
good.
just like visually. So I could like when you're editing, I feel like it's just like easier to see.
Right. Yeah, that's true too. If you're reading it aloud to yourself during the editing process as well, which I highly recommend that everybody do, that might make it more readable for yourself and the person grading it, i.e., myself, right?
Mhm. Okay, thank you.
No problem. I'm just going to wait a few more moments because we have, um, excuse me, we have several people here, but not everybody. So let's see who else pops in. Guess I better share my screen before we get started. Now, well, I have 7:36 here as the time. Oh, 7:39 on my phone, actually. Maybe it's just going to be a smattering of people attending today because it is the end of the week, pretty much. And that's fine. Lectures are recorded anyway. So, okay, let us begin. Okay, here we go. Wow. All right. I guess before we get too far into the rest of the chapter, it'll be a good idea to recap a couple of things. Uh, in this chapter, the concern is, once again, where the concern in chapter one for the authors was distinguishing between emotions as a category. This is, the category emotion is a big theme in chapter two, but chapter one was all about distinguishing the emotions as a distinct category, distinct that is from other kinds of psychological states like beliefs and desires and other affective states such as moods. I'm sure we all remember that quite well. In this chapter, the authors are exploring whether they can distinguish make distinctions within the category of emotion. And there were a couple of ways that we got a chance to talk about after I discussed the critical response, the upcoming critical response. One of those was to distinguish between positive and negative emotions, right? And typically we understand this positive or negative negativeness or negativity or positivity as valence, or less commonly polarity. So it seems intuitive that some emotions are positively valenced and some are negatively valenced. The simplest example that I can think of is that happiness is positively valenced, sadness would be negatively valenced, right? Or we would say that happiness has a positive polarity, whereas sadness has a negative polarity, perhaps. When we make a distinction like that, positive and negative, the distinction I just made between happiness and sadness, what we're doing is distinguishing between perhaps the positive and negative hedonic tones that those emotions each possess. So when I say that happiness is positively valenced, I mean it has a positive hedonic tone, which is to say that it is a type of pleasure. Ultimately, to experience happiness is to experience a type of pleasure. To experience sadness is to experience a type of displeasure. But there are other ways that we can cash this out too, right? We saw that we can distinguish between positive and negative conative states. Conative states are motivational states, right? Here, a positive emotion might be something that motivates you to perhaps continue having the experience that you're having, right? If, for example, you're happy because you're engaged in a fun activity, perhaps we can say that you are motivated to continue doing what you're doing so that you continue experiencing that affective state. A negatively valenced emotion, at least negatively valenced in terms of conative states, might be an emotion that motivates you to do something that will alleviate your experiencing of that emotion, right? So if you're feeling guilty about something, perhaps, that guilt is negative in the sense that it motivates you to take actions to alleviate that guilt by making amends with the person that you believe you've wronged, for example. So those are a couple of ways that we can carve up this positive and negative distinction. We can talk about a positive and negative valence or polarity in terms of hedonic tone, or we can talk about it in terms of conative states. Of course, that's not the only distinction that we can draw. We can also draw a distinction between conscious and unconscious emotions. And there are several different senses in which we could think of an emotion being conscious or unconscious, right? I think there were three. There were three that the authors, three that the authors introduced earlier in the chapter. Of course, there are in a similar way that there can be unfelt pains. The example is if I'm running a race and I injure myself, but I only feel the pain after the race is over, after I've crossed the finish line. That's an unfelt pain, and there might be unfelt emotions like that. A psychologist or neuroscience might see certain patterns of neural activation that are typically associated with an emotion, but if there is no corresponding behavior that's specific to that emotional profile, or if there's no self-report that the person is feeling this way or that way, that psychologist or neuroscience might say that this emotion is unconscious. And of course, a big way emotion could be an unconscious one is kind of in the Freudian sense too. I talked a little bit about last time how, even when Freud is wrong about the details of conscious versus unconscious stuff, he's often getting the broad strokes right. And what I mean there is that we can certainly perhaps repress or block certain emotions such that we're not consciously experiencing them. Nonetheless, they may still have an impact on behavior. The example in the textbook was, I think, of a parent who feels guilt over his perceived role in the death of a child. He doesn't feel guilty now, but it's this unconscious guilt which causes him to spoil his other kids, right? To treat them really well and perhaps treat them a little too well by spoiling them, right? So that's an example of, or that's a few examples of the ways in which emotions can be conscious or unconscious. Now, I mentioned earlier the category of emotion is pretty important throughout this chapter, because what the authors are doing, is exploring the divisions we can make within that category. And these divisions between, say, positive and negative, or conscious and unconscious emotions, don't really seem to threaten the unity of the category of emotion, right? So whether there are positive or negative emotions, or whether there are conscious and unconscious ones, it doesn't threaten the membership of any one of those particular emotions, the membership of it with the category or in the category of emotions, right? But there are, of course, other kinds of distinctions within the category of emotion that we could draw if we wanted to. A couple of these are as follows. Now, we didn't get a chance to discuss these last time, so I'd like to go over them now before we get to the rest of the chapter. We could have reflexive versus non-reflexive emotions. That's a distinction we might be able to make. And indeed, a lot of people do draw such a distinction between reflexive emotions, which are emotions that are directed toward oneself. So when we say reflexive in this context, we mean self-directed. Non-reflexive emotions would be other-directed. So this is an emotional, or rather a distinction that we can make within this category. Now, I wonder if we can come up with some examples together of emotions that are reflexive and emotions that are non-reflexive. So I put this question to all of you. Can anyone think of an emotion that you have experienced that's directed toward yourself, or of one that's directed at someone else?
Maybe shame.
Shame is a good one. Yeah, of course. Robin says pride. I think that's probably a good one. Yeah, jealousy, I would say, is other directed. Cringe, definitely, yes, could be either one. So yeah, just to iterate through, Robin says pride is reflexive. We've got cringe, we've got jealousy, embarrassment. So let's go through these one at a time. Why is pride reflexive? Well, usually we feel pride in ourselves, right? Pride over something we've done, like you can be proud of an accomplishment. And that's obviously reflexive because, you know, you can be proud of your own, you're usually proud of your own accomplishments if you're talking about pride with respect to something you've accomplished, of course, right? You've got an A+ on a really important paper, or if you graduate with distinction or something, you feel proud. You feel proud of yourself. However, sometimes we can also feel proud of other people, right? So maybe somebody could feel proud of their friend for something they accomplished. So when pride is felt for oneself, it's definitely reflexive, right? But if it's felt for someone else, it would be non-reflexive. But yeah, that's a good example. Cringe could be either. Hayden says cringe could be either, and I agree. I would say that if I feel cringe for myself, it's a kind of self-directed shame or embarrassment, but that can also be directed elsewhere. And it might be a little different if it's directed at someone else. If I'm cringing because of someone else, I might be embarrassed on their behalf. For example, if they don't realize how cringy they're being, perhaps I would feel a sort of sympathetic embarrassment for them, and that would be cringe. But I can also cringe at myself. Jealousy certainly seems to be other directed, because jealousy we can cash out in terms of a fear of loss, usually of emotional affection, right? So you're usually jealous of somebody else, right? If I'm jealous of someone else, or if I'm experiencing jealousy that's caused, it's usually because I fear that I might lose the affection of someone I care about to someone else, right? So it's other directed, but perhaps not directed at a single other, but at a situation. Embarrassment, I think, is related to cringe. But certainly if I feel embarrassed because of something I've done, that is absolutely reflexive, right? Like if I were going to a lecture and I forgot to put pants on, and this is a really far out example. I doubt anything like this has ever happened, but if I showed up in a rush to class and I realized I had neglected to put pants on, I would feel embarrassment, right? And that would be directed at me. But people in the class might feel embarrassment on my behalf as well. And that would be kind of a cringy situation if there ever was one. Satisfaction, Leslie says satisfaction, and I think that's a pretty good reflexive, a pretty good example of a reflexive emotion. I feel satisfaction for myself, right? And there is there, you know, it just struck me that there are further distinctions that we could draw here. Emotions could be reflective, or non-reflexive, because the object of the emotion is either me or someone else, or you know, I could be feeling it for myself. So I could feel, you know, something could be reflexive because I feel it for myself, or it could be reflexive because I'm the object of my emotional reaction. Likewise for non-reflexive. So there are even further ways to carve this up that the authors don't really explore. And fear from Robin again seems to be an interesting example. My fear is usually directed, well, this is where it gets tricky, right? I feel the fear for myself, but I'm not afraid of, you know, myself. I'm afraid of something else, right? So it's tricky. This is one possible way to carve things up. What are some others? Well, there's first order and second order emotions. Here's where we start getting a little meta. A first order emotion is about, you know, something particular, a particular object, an event, some scenario, a person. But a second order emotion is an emotion that is about another emotion. So if I was in a situation where I felt shame because I was afraid, my shame would be a second order emotion, but my fear is the first order emotion, right? And again, let's try and come up with some other examples to try and clarify this. First order versus second order emotions. First order emotions have a definite particular object, but the particular object of second order emotions are other emotions. So let's see what we've got in the chat. Yeah, okay, so let's see. Robin says second order happiness because you're in love. Yeah, I would say that's a very good example. You often, if you're in love, you often feel happy, content, just nice, you know. And if you feel that because you have found love, I would say, yes, that is certainly a second order emotion. Yeah, Leslie says frustration. So frustration depends what the object of frustration is. If I'm frustrated with myself because I can't do something right, I can't seem to master a particular recipe that I'm trying to cook, then I'd feel frustration for myself, and that would be a first order emotion. But if I was frustrated because of another emotion that I was feeling, or if my frustration led to anger, then my anger would be a second order emotion. I'm getting angry because I'm getting so frustrated. Perhaps I'm getting mad at myself. Why am I getting so frustrated? That would be a second order emotion. And jealousy, well, okay, so how could jealousy be second order? I'm not sure. Feeling shame because you're jealous. So Narmeen says jealousy, and Ellen says feeling shame because you're jealous would be second order. I agree with this. I'm not sure how jealousy would be a second order emotion just in its own right. Because remember, the object of a second order emotion is another emotion. So I suppose that jealousy might be second order in the sense that you fear the loss of, you know, a friend's attention or a lover's affection. So there's a fear there, which causes jealousy. But as we'll see later, this might just make jealousy a complex or non-basic emotion that's made out of basic emotions like fear. So, yeah, so lots of different ways we can do this, and none of them are like hard and fast, right? Isn't because jealousy can be layered with another emotion like anger or fear. Yeah, you're right. You're right. But a second order. Okay, so there's an important distinction to be aware of here that I'm kind of starting to see, and that is that certain emotions might be built up out of simpler ones, as we'll see in a moment. So fear, say fear of loss, might be one of the constituent parts of jealousy. But unless the jealousy's object is that fear, then the jealousy wouldn't be second order. It has to have another emotion as its object, right? So there can be complex emotions which might be built up out of simpler ones, but perhaps not all complex emotions are second order emotions, right? It's like how I can have a complex thought, but not all complex thoughts are metacognition. Metacognition is the analog of thinking here between second order emotions and second order thoughts. Second order thoughts or metacognition, that's thinking about thinking, right? In the same way, a second order emotion is an emotional experience whose object is another emotion, right? Suppose we could also call it meta emotion. You know, that sounds pretty cool. So yeah, okay, good. I'm glad that makes sense. Another interesting one, probably my favorite one actually, is between moral emotions and non-moral emotions. Some emotions help us to apprehend what we could call morally relevant features of certain situations. Other emotions that we might characterize as moral emotions are like emotions that are morally good. Other emotions might be morally bad. So an emotion could be moral in the sense that it helps us apprehend a morally relevant feature of a situation, or it can be moral in the sense that it's a good emotion or a bad emotion. So I've got here an example of a moral emotion that's good because it's good, or considered to be a good, and that's compassion. On the flip side, envy is a moral emotion in the sense that it's not a good emotion to have, right? So what are some other examples of moral emotions? I have lots here: compassion, guilt, anger, disgust, envy, and so on. But which of these emotions are moral emotions in the sense that they're good or bad? And which of these emotions are moral emotions in the sense that they help us to, in that they represent for us morally relevant features of a situation?
I have a question about that.
Okay.
Would sympathy and empathy kind of go in that lane? Because you're trying to morally, in a situation of like maybe like a social justice issue, and you're not of that race, of that sexual orientation, and you want to like empathize, like to morally kind of see where they're at. Like, could that be an example of it?
Absolutely. With the caveat that empathy might not be an emotion in its own right, but if you were to empathize with, say, somebody like out of your in group, and you exercise your empathy and put yourself in their shoes, then the emotions you feel when you do that, whatever they might be, might count as moral emotions, right? So,
Right.
yeah, like if you're trying to, like a simple example for me might be if I was trying to put myself in the shoes of, so you mentioned like social justice concerns. Imagine that I want to try and understand like the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So obviously I'm not a member of that group. But if I put myself in the situation of, say, a young Black person in America who has to deal with the police, and I think through what police interactions are like, I might come to empathetically feel afraid, for example, right? Like if I imagine that I'm in their shoes, then and I'm pulled over and I feel afraid, then that could very well count as a moral emotion, because it helps me to see the injustice that's there in like the way that the police deal with people from different groups, right? So, you know, just being afraid on its own isn't a moral emotion. But if I get to a certain kind of empathic fear that makes me understand something about the other's situation, then that could be a moral emotion for sure. Let's see what else we have. Gratitude. Yeah, gratitude is a good example of an emotion, of a moral emotion that is, you know, moral because it's considered a good, right? It maybe not even just a good, but perhaps a virtue or a character trait. To show gratitude when appropriate is something that we try to cultivate in people, right? So that's a good example. Regret. Robin says regret. Would regret be moral based off what you just explained? Yes. Regret lets us know that we've wronged somebody, right? Likewise, guilt, and less often shame. Shame is more like, I feel like I haven't lived up to some standard that I feel like I should live up to, right? But if I feel guilt, it's because I have perceived that I've done a moral transgression against somebody, perhaps. Like if you kill somebody, are you more likely to feel guilt or shame? I guess you could experience both. So Leslie asks, could you have a situation where you have a moral emotion used for a wrong thing? Like how someone can use dark empathy to manipulate someone else. Oh yeah, that's very interesting. So this is like maybe like a psychopath, okay, for example. So there's a few things to know about empathy. We can divvy it up in multiple ways, right? We can talk about, for example, affective empathy, which is coming to feel what other people feel. And then there's cognitive empathy, which is more about knowing what other people are thinking. Now, psychopaths might not have very good affective empathy. And this is evidenced by like their diminished fear response, a flat affect, things like that. But what psychopaths are good at is cognitive empathy. And if they use that to understand what other people are thinking and use that to manipulate them, that seems pretty dark. And I would not at all characterize that as moral. That would be like an immoral kind of empathy, right? So I wouldn't say that's a moral emotion. It's more like an immoral emotion or a misappropriated moral emotion. Then again, we are talking about cognitive empathy here, which is more about understanding that this person is feeling the way they are and thinking what they are, and not so much feeling what they're feeling for yourself. I hope that's clear. Isabella says contempt might be a non-moral emotion, like if you feel contempt towards a group or individual. I think it depends. I would say unjustified contempt seems quite immoral, right? Like if you have contempt toward a certain group because you're like a racist or something, certainly not moral. But you could have contempt for a group that might be justified, like my contempt for people who ride those scooters on the sidewalk. You know those little scooters that are all around Ottawa, and you're not allowed to ride them on the sidewalk. And I see someone riding on the sidewalk, and I feel so much contempt. So I don't know if my contempt is ultimately justified, but I'm just trying to make the example that if contempt is justified, perhaps it could be considered a moral emotion. But if it's not justified, then it's not, right? And this kind of ties us back to chapter 1, right? With standards of justification and correctness for emotions. let's see, how are we doing for time? Oh, one thing I forgot to mention. Yeah, I don't know if we're going to get through this whole chapter today because there are some very dense bits towards the middle. So, and because we only have only 14 people here, that's just fine with me. So I'm happy to keep talking about moral emotions too, because those are cool. Just to kind of wrap up the moral emotions bit, I want to go through. Well, disgust is particularly interesting. Anger and disgust are examples that I don't think I saw mentioned in the chat, but I'm curious. Anger is a little bit more easy. Can we? I mean, we can understand how anger might be, good or bad. There might be situations where it's appropriate to become angry and situations where it's not appropriate to become angry. But in the sense that anger helps us to apprehend morally relevant features of a situation, how could anger be a moral emotion, I wonder? See if I get any answers in the chat. Well, if you think of the last time you became angry, it might have been because somebody did something that you perceived as an injustice or as an offense, right? And this is what, if we were to, kind of follow Richard Lazarus and his appraisal theory of emotions, where each emotion has a core relational theme between the organism and the environment, we would say that anger's core relational theme is, that somebody has wronged you. So morally, anger is a moral emotion, lets you know that somebody has committed an injustice against you, has wronged you, has tried to harm you, perhaps. And it makes you want to set things right. You get angry and you want to seek retribution and remedy the situation. Ah, yes, Isabella and Leslie. Yes, okay, you're all good. You all see this. Yes. Like Leslie says, if you see somebody getting bullied and you become angry, yeah, that would be like a moral anger or righteous anger, as it's sometimes called. And notice you're not angry because it's happening to you. You're angry on the person's behalf, the person who's being bullied, that is. You're angry on their behalf. So that would be moral anger or righteous anger. And as Narmeen says here, anger helps us to differentiate between unjust and just behaviors or situations. Absolutely correct. When we get angry, it's probably because we've experienced for ourselves or seen an unjust thing happen to someone else, right? Yeah, exactly. Isabella, you're right here. When you get angry, you're physiologically prepared to fight. It's the fight or flight response. When you get angry, you have adrenaline, increase in heart rate, the skin, sometimes people even kind of get like goosebumps. And this is actually an evolutionary holdover for when humans had a lot more hair. And we would kind of puff up, I guess, look bigger. Nowadays, great apes, if you look at other great apes, they still do this. They puff up, get big, and like gorillas beat their chest. So we're getting ready for a fight, and the point of the fight is to remedy the situation, perhaps. So if I'm a gorilla or a chimpanzee and someone takes my banana, then I can get mad and start pant-hooting, and the chimpanzee who took my banana is going to go, uh-oh, I'm about to get beaten up, sorry, here's your banana, something like that, right? So it's a very basic evolutionary take on it, but I hope it illustrates what I mean. Oh, this is a good question. Would you say that a first order emotion is usually felt more than the second order emotion because it happens first, or could a second order emotion affect the person more? I think it could probably go either way. And it's not as if you feel both emotions equally at the same time. Like if I'm afraid, maybe I have an irrational fear, like of birds. So I'm at the park walking my dog and a bird flies past and I recoil in fear. I'm just afraid. And then I notice that someone has seen me and they're like, oh, look at him. He's afraid of birds. And then I feel shame from my fear. Like, oh, why am I afraid of birds? You know, stupid. I shouldn't be afraid of birds, but I am. I'm ashamed of that. So in that case, it's successive. The first order would precede the second order emotion. But it doesn't have to always be like that, I suppose. I suppose they could co-occur. Or you might alternate between the one and the other, just as long as the object of the second order emotion is a first order emotion. It doesn't matter. It could happen in a number of ways, I suppose. I want to talk about disgust very quickly. How could disgust be a moral emotion? I'm sorry to keep going on about this, but I find the moral emotions fascinating. If you think of disgust, disgust is, it certainly seems to be a negative emotion. It seems to play some role in helping us avoid things that might harm us, right? In the same way that fear does. Yeah, disgust at pedophilia would be a moral emotion for sure. Yeah, so that was James's suggestion. Cameron agrees. Yeah, so if I feel disgust at, say, I don't know, something rotten, some bad food, that's not really a moral emotion. That is to protect myself. You know, if the food smells disgusting or has a disgusting taste, that's, you know, so-called nature's way of letting me know that it might harm me. I might introduce some kind of germs or something dirty or icky, which would make me sick or kill me, right? But disgust can also be a moral emotion. We can get disgusted at moral situations. Somebody might feel disgust upon learning that their neighbor is a pedophile, for example, right? And you might be like, ugh, right? I have an example, which is, best example I can think of, where I knew this person who, just kind of like a friend of a friend. And he was a bit of an interesting character, you know, but he was always wanting to hang out and stuff. So I thought, whatever, I'll hang out with the guy. Behaves kind of strange. He's a bit of an oddball, but I figure, we're all a little eccentric, bit of an oddball. So am I. What's the big deal? Invite him to hang out with some other friends of mine. And I start hearing things from my friends, you know. I start hearing like, oh, this guy, he didn't pay his bar tab. This guy, he was behaving inappropriately with this lady over here. And I start to get a little creeped out, you know, which is kind of, creepiness is related to disgust, you know. Are spiders disgusting or are they creepy, you know? Are stalkers disgusting or are they creepy? Probably both, right? So anyway, I stop hanging out with this guy because I'm like, you know what? Something's not right. I just get a weird vibe. And normally I'm a pretty rational guy, but here I had this kind of gut feeling. This guy is something off. Months go by, and I find out that this person was arrested by the Ottawa police for sexual harassment and forcible confinement. And as soon as I read this in the police report, I just felt dirty, like I had been contaminated by hanging out with him, right? And you know, that was disgust in the moral sense. I just felt like I want to, it's icky. Like, I can't believe I hung out with that guy. Like, it was like, ugh, you know? So that is moral disgust right there. That's right. You're right, Narmeen. In the sense that disgust, like moral and non-moral disgust, both arguably play an adaptive role, right? Like non-moral disgust plays a role in the sense that I said earlier. If I'm disgusted by these red berries, maybe the red berries are bad for me, right? If I eat the red berries, I could die, right? But if I'm disgusted or creeped out by a conspecific, another member of my own species, that could be a way of letting me know that there is some kind of danger there, some kind of danger to my well-being. And it's not exactly the same as fear, but it's similar in the same in that the core relational theme of that discussed would be like, it's not good for you to be associated with this person, right? And this is why we have gut reactions. So everybody out there, use your rationality, but also don't be afraid to listen to your gut, because gut reactions like this are an evolved response to danger. So if someone's being creepy, you don't have to be a jerk to them, but also, you don't have to be their friend either. There's a reason we have these responses. So that's my disgust example. Let's see, 8:17. Okay, we're doing okay here. Don't know if we'll get through the whole thing, but that's fine. It's Thursday, for goodness sake. Now, where are we next? We want to make some more distinctions between the emotions within the category of the emotions, right? Now, one of the ways that we can do this is by talking about basic emotions and complex emotions. Indeed, I've mentioned basic emotions a lot in this class, as particularly Ekman's understanding of the basic emotions. The basic idea behind basic emotions is similar to the idea that we find in the natural sciences in chemistry, for example. If you think of the periodic table of elements, all of the elements on the table we could consider basic, in the sense that other molecules, other chemicals, are made up of those constituent elements. And yes, I know there are elements that are much more complex than others, right? Hydrogen is just a single proton, but uranium has an atomic mass of what is it? It's got like 235 protons in there, right? And an equivalent amount of neutrons. So it's very complicated. But I mean this in the sense that, if you looked at like a water molecule, H2O, it would be complex. It's got 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom in there. But its constituent elements, those hydrogen and oxygen atoms, those would be basic. And in a similar vein, at least intuitively, it seems that some emotions are basic, while others we could consider complex, in the sense that they are built up out of other non-complex emotions. So, intuitively, there's a lot of appeal here. And we've already seen this in our discussion today. Maybe jealousy is complex because it's made up out of a basic emotions, and one of those is fear, which is fairly basic, I think. The authors pose an interesting question here. Could this be why, if intuitively we're all kind of hanging on to this distinction between basic and complex emotions, is this why we can easily attribute some emotions to non-human animals, but not other emotions? For example, I can say, and maybe I'm anthropomorphizing here. Oh, hello, Tula, just in time. I was going to use you as an example. Come here. Come here. So, I can say, I think without the risk of anthropomorphizing, oh, hi, Tula, that my dog is happy, at least much of the time. What do you say? You happy dog? Yeah, happy dog. So I got a happy dog right here, right? I mean, and we talk about pets this way all the time. My dog's happy. Oh, everyone says hi. Yes. Hello. Oh, God. Okay, I better put you down now, or you will become unhappy. So, I mean, I can say, oh, my dog's happy, and maybe dog happiness isn't exactly like human happiness. Oh, thanks, guys. Yeah. Oh, my dog's a sweetheart. She's great. I can attribute, say, happiness to my dog, right? Tail's wagging, ears are up, head's cocked slightly to the side. I got a happy dog right there, right? But what if I attributed something else, a more complicated second order emotion, perhaps? Like, would it make sense to attribute Schadenfreude to a dog? Maybe not, right? And maybe that's because animals don't have the complexity of emotional experience as we do. I'm curious what everybody's intuitions here are, because I can think of one possibly complex emotion that my dog definitely seems to experience. But before I tell you all about that, I'm curious, what do you think about attributing complex emotions to non-human animals?
I have an example that I saw like in a documentary.
Yeah,
I saw that like it's like a fact that elephants they grieve for like a really long time,
that's a
and they
great example.
actually go back to like where their loved ones died and like grieve there. And I feel like grief is like a pretty tricky emotion, like even for humans. So I feel like if an animal can have that of such like, you know, of such a capacity to go back, I think it's like every year or like every couple of months, like after an elephant died. So I feel like that's a good example of one.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good example. And it also highlights a further distinction. There are more sophisticated non-human animals and less sophisticated ones, right? I would say it's very plausible to attribute grief to elephants because they exhibit a kind of grief behavior, right? And similarly for the great apes as well. They also seem to mourn their dead, and even some monkeys as well. But could a dog experience grief? I'm not sure. And Robin mentions jealousy. And yeah, that was the example I was actually going to mention. If we just get straight my chat out here. Jealousy is complex, but Tula definitely seems to get jealous. If I spend too much time fawning over my cat, Tula will protest with a grumbly sort of growl and, kind of, look as if she's done something wrong, right? And I'd say jealousy is a complex emotion, and dogs seem to get jealous. Sadness, James says sadness. Yeah, but sadness is pretty basic. Sadness isn't complicated because, an emotion isn't complicated because lots of different things can elicit it. It's complicated because it might be built up out of simpler parts, right? Simpler emotions. And I would consider sadness to be basic, whereas regret or grief is more complicated and probably includes sadness. Like grief includes sadness for sure, right? Cameron points out that only certain mammals have the mental cognition to have complex emotions. Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. And that kind of speaks to my point earlier. The great apes, elephants, certain birds, and cetaceans, whales and dolphins, right? These are very complex animals in terms of their brains and social lives. Likewise with dogs. Dogs are social animals, and wolves for that matter. I would say that the more complicated the animal's brain and their social structure, the more complicated emotions they are capable of experiencing, actually. That's my little pet hypothesis there. Sorry, pet hypothesis. That was a pun. Yeah, a dog grieving after his owner died. Yeah, oh yeah, I'm sure there's lots of stories like that. I know of one where a dog waited for its owner for years, which is just sad. That's so sad. Loneliness, yeah. Loneliness seems complicated, and I certainly would say that some non-human animals can experience loneliness. Again, I have a dog who lets me know she's very upset every time I get back from going out somewhere. Aw. Okay, feeling anxiety or being alone for one. Yeah, definitely. Whether it's simple or complicated, animals can certainly feel either one. This here, this is an interesting point. Where's it gone? feeling betrayal when the owner leaves. I mean, I don't know. Perhaps if they did, that would seem to be a complicated emotion. But perhaps they don't feel betrayal, but only loneliness, which may be simpler. I'm not sure. This is all quite complicated stuff, and really speaks to the point that there are, even within the divisions that the authors make, there may perhaps be other ways to carve all of this up, right? So let's carry on briefly. This idea of basic emotions is not new, right? If we go back to ancient Greece or Rome, excuse me, we go back in time, we can find that the Stoics, school of philosophers, school of ancient philosophy, identified only 4 basic emotions: delight, distress, desire, and fear. Later on, as we get closer to modernity, somebody like Thomas Hobbes identifies 7 basic emotions, or simple passions, as he calls them. And those were, of course, appetite, desire, love, aversion, hatred, joy, and grief. And his contemporary Rene Descartes identified others. He identified admiration, surprise, love, hate, desire, joy, and sadness. Now, notice that we don't identify all of these as emotions anymore, particularly desire or aversion, right? These would be other mental states, other cognitive states. Likewise with appetite, I wouldn't really say is emotion. But then again, there's some crossover. Emotion, passion are not exactly the same thing, as we'll see in a moment. Yeah, Robin, good question. I don't know why admiration, surprise is one emotion. I suppose, yeah, I don't know. I have trouble making sense of that one. I mean, I can see how love and hate are emotions. I can see why desire is not an emotion, but another kind of affective state, perhaps. But admiration and surprise seems to be a lumping together of two different kinds of things. I would have to actually probably go back to the original text on that, which unfortunately kind of falls outside the scope of what we're doing, but maybe I can do that over the weekend and come up with an answer. But yeah, admiration, surprise, I don't know. Maybe because when we are surprised, at least pleasantly surprised, we admire the object of our surprise, like, oh, what a nice surprise. I'm really not sure what Descartes means there, but so we don't really divide things up the exact same way nowadays. Thanks to Darwin, thanks to Charles Darwin's influence, we've retained the basic and non-basic distinction in contemporary discussion about emotion. But thanks to Darwin, we don't understand basic emotions along the lines of what Hobbes or Descartes suggest on the previous slide, right? Darwin, incidentally, wrote a book called The Expression of the Emotions in Man and in Animals, which he published, I think it was after The Origin of Species. But Darwin observed when he was sailing around on the Beagle, the voyage of the Beagle. This was the ship that Darwin was on. And he was commissioned, he was a naturalist, of course, and he was supposed to sail all around and collect different samples, fossils, wildlife. They went to the Galapagos Islands. And of course, this is how Darwin got the inspiration to formulate his theory of evolution by natural selection. But while he's encountering these animals, and more importantly, while he's encountering other people, he's sailing and he's making contact with people, with indigenous people, with people who have settled in and around South America. He's making contact with lots of different folks outside of Europe. And he's noticing that there are certain emotions that seem to be common, not only to all of these different people, but to animals too, like surprise. Whether you're a human or an animal, if you're surprised, there are certain things that happen. Your eyes widen, for example, and perhaps the mouth is agape, like, ah. I'm surprised. Likewise with fear, the eyes also widen. Why? Well, if the eyes widen and our gaze is focused on the object of our fear and surprise, well, that emotional reaction, the widening of the eyes and the focusing on the eliciting event or thing, draws our attention to it and helps us see what the heck is going on, right? So there are basic emotions, according to Darwin, which are universally expressed in terms of, the kinds of things that happen when people or animals have them, right? I mentioned before the point about maybe getting goosebumps if you're angry or afraid might seem pretty weird for humans with not much hair. But if you're a great ape or a dog and you're scared or angry and you get goosebumps, well, it makes your hair follicles stand on end and it makes you puff up and look bigger so that maybe whatever you're scared of becomes scared of you or something like that, right? So it's just a way that nature has endowed us to look bigger in the case of things that might pose a danger to us or a threat to us. And the psychologist Ekman, following Darwin, kind of names basic emotions using similar criteria. He names basic emotions as those emotions that are universally expressed in terms of facial expression on the one hand, but also other forms of behavior. They're universally expressed and universally recognized across all cultures. So Ekman's basic emotions are, let's see if I can remember them all. We have happiness. There are 6 of them. So we have happiness, we have sadness, we have anger and fear, and we have surprise and disgust. So those are the 6 emotions that Ekman first identified as basic because they're universal. So they're universal in the sense that Darwin, voyaging on the Beagle, might contact some uncontacted tribe in South America. And if Darwin was happy, or if a member of this tribe was happy, they would each be able to recognize it. The smile, the slight squinting of the eyes, the relaxation, that when you're happy, you're just kind of, I'm happy, right? So Darwin would have recognized this in an individual in an uncontacted society. And likewise, the person who lives in that society would recognize Darwin's happiness. They're universal in this sense, right? But there are other ways of understanding what a universal emotion is too. One is it's similar in that it's evolutionary, but it's different, right? It's different in the sense that Ekman and Darwin, they do emphasize the evolutionary history of these emotions, but they place a little bit less emphasis on the adaptive functions of those emotions and more on the fact that they're universally recognized, especially Ekman. Whereas other evolutionary psychologists like Cosmides and Tooby, for example, they would say that basic emotions are those emotions that have a traceable evolutionary history, and we can trace it back through our evolutionary history, in part because of the adaptive benefits that these emotions would have conferred upon our ancient ancestors. Okay, so Robin, that's a good point. What would be the criteria for recognizing an emotion in this sense? Behavior and facial expression mostly. And you're right, jealousy might not be apparent right away because of somebody's actions. That's true. Jealousy is complex, perhaps because it's not straightforward like recognizing a basic emotion. If I'm jealous, there's not any one particular facial expression or series of behaviors that everyone who's experiencing jealousy performs or experiences, right? Let's say somebody is jealous that the person they have a crush on likes somebody else. They might respond, they might express that jealousy by acting angrily towards that person's partner, Or they might sort of repress the jealousy and act just kind of awkward and weird because they're trying not to show that they're jealous, right? So jealousy doesn't have a straightforward behavioral profile like the basic emotions do. So, but in any case, yeah, one way to identify basic emotions as such, oh, excuse me, would be to point to their traceable evolutionary history. And we can do this with basic emotions like fear. You know, fear is supposed to help us avoid physical dangers. Disgust is maybe evolved to help us avoid putting dangerous stuff in our bodies, or for avoiding things which might cause us to become ill, like to spread disease, right? Just consider and this is one reason why the emotion of disgust is considered to be basic and universal. Think about the incest taboo, which is common throughout, I think, pretty much all human cultures, right? There's a taboo against incest. And that's because, or arguably evolved because, getting it on with people that are too genetically similar to you does not produce very fit offspring. So we evolved to be disgusted at it, right? The disgust is like, don't go and get together with your relatives. You're going to have some not very fit offspring. So we've evolved to feel like kind of disgust at that prospect, right? What's the final way that we can carve this up? Well, others might say that we can distinguish between basic emotions and complicated emotions because basic emotions have distinct neural pathways. I won't say too much about that, other than this does seem to be true of the emotions that, for example, Ekman identifies as basic. For example, fear. Fear has a pretty characteristic neurological sort of response. The amygdala is recruited during fear response, right? So we see a lot of activity in the amygdala if somebody's afraid. Interestingly, psychopaths who have a diminished fear response, they tend to have smaller amygdalas than so-called neurotypical brains. So that's interesting. But one thing to note is that none of these are mutually exclusive. These are all compatible with one another. And you know, if there really is a basic, non-basic distinction, these should all converge with one another too. The universal recognizability, traceable evolutionary history, and distinct neural pathways. These all work together, perhaps, to separate basic from non-basic emotions. For that reason, you know, we talk of affect programs today. Affect programs would involve you know, like universally recognizable facial expressions and behaviors, an evolutionary history, and neurological profiles, right? Affect programs, as the authors discuss them, would correspond to a profile like the following. Certain affect programs would have specific changes in facial expressions of particular emotions, specific muscular changes in orientation and posture. You know, if you're afraid, you might sit up. If you're disgusted, you might recoil. Expressive vocal changes. So if you're surprised or startled, you might shout out in surprise. And of course, changes in the hormonal system and then in the nervous system. You know, if one is angry or afraid, you're probably going to get a boost of adrenaline, which is a hormone, and changes in the nervous system, like the fight or flight response is governed by the autonomic nervous system, right? So, or is it the parasympathetic nervous system? I can't quite remember, but I'm not a neuroscientist, so whatever. Now, something else that's interesting about affect programs, they should also correspond to Jerry Fodor's characterization of a cognitive module. So affect programs, or the systems that realize affect programs, should be modular in the Fodorian sense. I'll explain what that means in a moment. Where are we here? Narmeen asks, is there a possibility to feel emotions with literally zero affective programs or those profiles? Oh. Possibly. Would they be emotions in their own right? I don't know. In a little bit, and I don't know if we'll get this far today, but in a little bit, there is introduced a distinction between affect programs and other things that we might call eruptive episodes and other kinds of things which may not be emotions, but which might recruit cognitive and behavioral resources that the emotions do recruit. So, I could, and this is the example from the textbook. Somebody might tell a joke, and maybe it's an inappropriate joke that's potentially offensive. Now, I might not actually be offended by that joke myself. I might not feel the offense, but I might behave as if I am offended because it's happening in a situation where it's not appropriate to joke about what the person is joking about, right? So that's kind of one example of that kind of thing. But in that case, I'm not really feeling the offense, right? So it's tricky, but I suppose that's an example that I can think of that kind of fits with what you're saying there, Narmeen. Let's see how we're doing for time. Not too much time left. I kind of figured that I wouldn't be able to finish all of this today, but that's okay. Perhaps we can pick it up on, is it Tuesday? Yeah, Tuesday. End of the week. My sense of time just goes out the window. Well, let's see here. So I was saying that affect programs also seem to be modular. The author's right. Closely associated to this school of thought, one finds the idea that the systems responsible for these changes, so the changes here that form the profile that affect programs correspond to, such changes are to a large extent modular in Fodor's sense. That is, among other things, that they are 1, automatic, 2, specific to a restricted domain of stimuli, 3, quick, and 4, cognitively impenetrable. These are not all of the characteristics of a Fodorian module, but they're the important ones for the purposes of the authors. And I think that what I will do is just kind of spell out how fear or fright might be modular before we wrap up today. So let's do that. By the way, if anyone is curious about modularity, and I think this is a distinction I should probably make here. There's a difference between like Fodorian modules, which you can read about in Jerry Fodor's book, The Modularity of Mind. It's basically a book arguing for faculty psychology. That is the idea that our basic perceptual systems and as well as our language systems are probably modular in the sense that they're informationally encapsulated, domain specific, automatic, fast. In other words, they're underwritten by all these little cognitive modules, each of which has a certain domain of inputs and a certain computational task to perform. So that's modularity in the Fodorian sense. There's also massive modularity, which is what you find in like evolutionary psychology. And massive modularity is like there's modules for everything. Fodor would just argue that it's our perceptual systems, our language, stuff like that. That's what's modular. An evolutionary psychologist says, oh, it's modules all the way down, though. Modules all the way down. And these modules evolved to perform an adaptive function. I'm not going to try to adjudicate between the two here, but just know I'm talking about the Fodorian modules. So in what sense is fear or fright modular? Well, it's certainly automatic, right? When you are frightened, it's an automatic response. At least, I can't think of a sense in which we become frightened deliberately or consciously. Although perhaps one of you could think of an exception. Whatever underwrites fear or fright also seems to involve a restricted domain of stimuli, right? So in the case of fright, stimuli that pose a danger, they elicit fear because the eliciting stimulus poses a danger. If there were to suddenly be an earthquake, you might feel very afraid automatically. And that's because the stimuli you are recognizing through your fear, it is a proximal danger to you, right? Fright is also fast. So it's not only automatic, it's fast. Just think of the last time you were scared, right? It was probably quite, it came on very quickly, your fright. And fear or fright might also be cognitively impenetrable, which means that your beliefs can't penetrate and affect the computational processes that are going on in those modules that are underwriting your fear response. So, your belief that there is not really a danger present might not diminish your fear response. And indeed, this is the whole point behind seeing like a horror movie or something, right? We know when we go to see one that we're not in danger. Yet the point of going to see a horror movie is to, scare ourselves a little bit and have fun that way, right? My favorite example, by the way, it's got to do with this robot stuff again. But I like the uncanny valley as an example of this. The uncanny valley is a feeling of eeriness that's elicited by very human-like artifacts like humanoid robots, badly animated CGI, wax figures, automatons. And elsewhere, I've argued that this uncanny sensation or eeriness is really a type of anxiety, which is itself a type of fear. In this case, it's anxiety whose object is uncertainty about the ontological status of what you're looking at, right? This is why wax figures and robots are creepy. They look very lifelike and animate, almost as if they could come to life and have thoughts of their own. But of course, they're inanimate objects. So that's why they make you feel weird. But knowing that, if I bring you in and I have a robot that looks really human and moves around and speaks and acts like a human, you might feel a little weirded out by that. Like, oh, geez, is that thing alive? Is that thing really alive? It feels creepy. And I might tell you, no, it's just a robot. It doesn't feel anything. It doesn't really think. It has no soul. It's a stupid robot. It's a lifeless machine. Okay, it's not alive. It doesn't really have thoughts. Nonetheless, you can't help but look at it as if it's alive and has thoughts. That is perceptually speaking. Your perceptual systems still treat it as a living being, even when it's not. It's actually an inanimate object. Same with lots of things that we're afraid of. Some people are afraid of roller coasters. And, you could tell them this roller coaster right here, it's just been inspected by the awesome roller coaster inspection company, which is the best roller coaster inspection company in the world, in fact. And they gave this roller coaster an A+ for safety. And here's the report. I'll show you the report of all the details. It's a safe roller coaster, but people might still be afraid of it, right? I guess, yeah, should we wrap it up there? 8:51. I think we should wrap it up. What do you guys think? Oh, okay, here we go. Well, we've got a few more minutes, so let's see if we can get through one more slide. I just want you to keep this distinction in mind going forward. There are highly specific classifications of basic emotions in psychology, and we've just gone over some of them. And we've seen also that this is different from the philosophical tradition. we've seen that too. You know, the basic emotions that Darwin or Ekman identifies are different than those of Hobbes or Descartes, which are, of course, also different from, I don't know, the Stoics, right? So that's fine. We just need to keep that distinction in mind. So now that we've introduced this idea of basic and non-basic emotions, as well as the other distinctions like first order and second order, or moral and non-moral, we can start to ask, is it true that emotion, the word emotion in everyday usage, remember, we're doing a little bit of ordinary language philosophy here, does that actually correspond to a unified class of mental states, right? Are basic and non-basic emotions actually a unified class of mental states that we can treat as a category of, the category of emotions? That's one question we need to ask to answer whether the category of emotions is united or not. Another one that we can ask is, how do we understand the relationship between basic and non-basic emotions? And I think before we'll wrap it up, we'll just tackle number one. So we have to remember, if we're asking whether the word emotion corresponds to a legitimate category of emotion that includes both basic and non-basic, we have to keep in mind that emotion is neither universally translatable nor even that old of a word, right? That is to say that if you go around the world and visit people who speak a different language, they might not have a word for emotion that translates to emotion. They might have words for feelings, for affective states, but it might not neatly translate into, emotion and what that word in English actually refers to. And emotion is quite new, right? In the English-speaking world, and even throughout Europe, going all the way back to the Greeks, we've talked about passions, right? For the Greeks, this was pathos. Pathos. Passions, the way we talk about them and have talked about them in the past, certainly include emotions, but they also included things like desires and pleasures and pains. So the passions is a large category, which might include emotions, but also other things that are not emotions. And also keep in mind that we don't seem to distinguish between emotions as we do, or the same way we do with other mental states, right? If I want to differentiate mental states like beliefs and desires from, say, perceptions, I can usually do it propositionally, right? Beliefs and desires are propositional attitudes. Perceptions are not. I would say, Leslie, I would say desire is not an emotion. It is an affective state, and it's a cognitive state, but I don't know that it's an emotion, right? Usually we would understand a desire as a propositional attitude, which is a way of understanding mental states. Pleasure is perhaps a fundamental constituent of emotions, right? Hedonic tone, remember we saw last time that hedonic tone, is it pleasurable or painful, pleasurable or displeasurable? That's an irreducible part of phenomenality, right? Of the phenomenology of emotions, right? So yes, pleasure is not an emotion in its own right, but it's like a fundamental component. So yeah, no, you're right about that. Desire, I would say, is a propositional attitude. It's an attitude that I take towards a proposition, right? Josh desires that he has pizza for dinner, right? It's pretty propositional. Same with beliefs, but we don't do this with emotions, right? We don't distinguish emotions this way. As we saw, we distinguish emotions from other mental states, not only because of their content, their intentionality, but their epistemology and their phenomenology. And these are all different from other kinds of mental states like beliefs and desires. We differentiate beliefs and desires, not just propositionally, but because they're propositional, they have different content, right? We don't seem to do that with subclasses of emotions. In fact, I could say in a very real way, the content might be the same. You know, that what the emotion is about could be the same for different emotions, right? I can be afraid of the dog, or I can be happy to see the dog. I could be disgusted at the dog, right? All the same content, the dog, but different emotions, right? So we don't do it the same way as we do with other mental states. All right, now what time have we got? 8:57 on my phone. So I think we'll probably leave it there. Now for next time, I want to wrap up this chapter, but the rest of the chapter is so dense and dry and honestly not that fun to read. So I will quickly go over the rest of the chapter for next time. And then the next chapter of the book, if I'm not mistaken, the next chapter of the book is emotions, beliefs, and desires. That looks like fun. I'm sure I can do a decent job with this chapter. So we'll finish up the rest of this chapter next time, and we'll start chapter 3. And that's that. Now, before I go, does anyone have any questions? Oh, no, you're welcome, Isabella. Everyone wants to start the weekend. Yes. Yes. Okay. Well, happy weekend, everybody. It was a fun class. This was good. Take care. And I'll just sit here until everyone leaves, in case anyone has a question. All right. That's it. Excellent.